Hello, and welcome to this session on one of our hot trends for 2017, post-truth and political branding. Now, we'd originally nested this within our wider session for our marketing plan blueprint clients, but we found two things. One, it was a hot topic that was interest to many people. And the second was that it required a little bit more depth than we could cover in a 1-hour session with everything else. So we thought we'd break it out and share it with you in a little bit more depth. Before you do anything else, this is a very important trend, so do give yourself time to discover it. Turn off everything else that's operating in the background, including emails, Skype, iTunes, or any extra programs. Silence your phone and close your door and really give yourself up to listening and thinking about this, because there are some important and very challenging decisions that you might need to make off the back of this. First of all, probably a bit of a spoiler in the title of this session, but what was the word of the year for 2016? According to Oxford dictionaries and a number of other dictionary sources, the word of the year last year was the word post-truth. And what do we mean when we talk about post-truth? So this is how the Oxford Dictionary defines it: relating to or donating circumstances in which objective facts are less influential than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And there's a little bit more background on that if you'd like to listen and find out more about it. I'm originally a linguist, so I actually love this idea, and I think it's quite interesting. And the interesting thing for me, though, is we as researchers have known for, I say for around 40 years, but it's probably closer to 50 years now, that consumers do not make rational decisions, that appeals to emotion and their personal belief set really are very, very strong. And you can see I've included some of the books where we understand this. Economists have known this now for around 20 or 30 years. And at the point where economists got it, governments began to recognize it. So it's not that we haven't understood that human beings are not really rational actors who behave in a world where there are neutral, objective facts. So when we come to think about the idea of post-truth and political branding, what you have to ask yourself is what has actually changed. I think if you look at the way things have changed around the world, what's changed is the extent to which ordinary people are now recognizing this truth about the way they make decisions, and the degree to which they're actually acknowledging themselves that that's the case. So historically, I've been told many times by consumers in focus groups or by clients when they make a decision that this decision has been a completely rational, neutral decision made by them in their homo economicus mode. My particular favourite is doing focus groups with people where they'll tell me that they never respond to any kind of direct advertising, and I've actually done interviews where people have told me that when it's been the case that I know they were recruited because they did respond to a particular ad. So I think that knowledge of ourselves is coming through, but also our knowledge that what I believe is more important. Now, you can find that disturbing, that distrust of facts, but it is now part of the way people exist. And I think that what's happened here is what we've seen is a shift in the need for trust. So now Edelman, who do a trust barometer, this is in the US, say 60% of people say a person like themselves is a credible source of information. The same number who agree that an academic or technical expert sources. So we've got a little bit more distrustful of experts, I think partly because there are so many different voices out there. And one famous example of this was in the Brexit debate, and you can actually use the YouTube link here. If you're an MTR Premium Trends Hub member, or a member of the Marketing Plan Blueprint, you can go in and download the full presentation and click through to this link. The famous moment where Michael Gove, who was one of the faces of the Brexit campaign last year, was interviewed on Sky News and given a big, long list of all the experts who said that this would be terrible for Britain. At which point he said, people have had enough of experts. But as we say, what has changed is not that people don't trust anyone anymore, but that shift in trust, as we say, to people like ourselves. So we trust people around us because we've lost trust in all of the other institutions. If you are a government or an institution, this is something that you need to be thinking about what you can do to win trust back. But I think we need to recognize that this is out there. So what was our aha moment in this around the shift from talking about and thinking about post-truth to what the implications are for branding? So really what we're saying is, now in the post-truth age, what I think and feel is what matters about how I make my decisions. So therefore, when I'm making decisions, what I think and believe you think and feel matters to me. I'm looking for sources that think and feel like me. The business implication of that is that brands need to know and communicate where they stand on things with customers. So customers want to know about those issues. And we've actually seen that growing in terms of recognition. So Unilever, which is one of the big global brands that spent a lot of time thinking about this and acting on it, have done research where they've looked at the fact that 1/3 of consumers are now choosing to buy from brands they believe are doing social or environmental good. If you look beyond those consumers to brands that are looking at for people who think and feel like them, then I think that number would be even larger. So 1/3 of consumers are looking at this. So this is increasingly important. To me, as someone who looks at this and tries to predict where we're going with these things, it's always interesting to look at what's driving some of those changes. And I think when we look at trends, one of the things we have to recognize is trends, to quote Shakespeare. I always love getting a Shakespeare quote into any presentation, as those of you who've listened to many of my presentations before will know. They tend not to come as single spies, but come as battalions. And what we see is trends often drive other trends, they combine trends, they bring things together, they change things. And here are 6 factors that we think are driving this change in a lack of trust and a focus on looking for people who share your values. We see a much more uncertain world. We see a world of rising inequality. We are now at the situation where the top 1% of those who own wealth own more wealth than the other 99%. So we're seeing the middle losing ground. We're seeing a gap that we haven't seen. Typically when we see these historic levels of inequality, we see major disruption, we see major upheaval. The second thing that we see is a change in people's relative power base. So the traditional centers of power have shifted. We've seen a rise in Asia Pacific. We saw the BRIC economies. Now that's softened, but we're seeing where power sits globally, particularly the rise of China, but a shift in where the axis of global power shifts. So we've moved from what was a bipolar world with Russia into the world where and America into a world where Western liberal democracy was seen to have triumphed, into a world where we've recognized that that has changed. As I say this, we are now 1 day after America announced that it was removing from the Paris Agreement, but we've seen the EU and China come to an agreement. So we're seeing those axes and debate shifting. And as we've seen that, people are sensing, people who are in places where they sense that they had leadership either through economic power within their own community or as traditional centers of power, we are seeing a rise in issues of identity and culture. So we've seen a fragmentation of society where we're looking at ourselves and recognizing that we are different and very, very different groups. So we're looking within that at groups where we see rainbow alliances, the recognition of our sexuality, of shape, of size. The image, by the way, is now the range of Mattel Barbies. Now, historically, Barbie was actually a figure that no woman could actually live up to. She wouldn't actually be able to walk if she did. But what we've seen is Barbie and Mattel respond to that so that you now have multiple colors. That's actually existed with Barbie within the 80s, to different shapes, different sizes, different ways of looking at this. So more curvy, more plump Barbie. So all of those issues coming through. But as we've seen that fragmentation, we've seen traditional sources of identity also seek to claw that back. So if you look at multicultural societies, if you look at what sat behind Brexit, one of the big predictors of how people would vote in Brexit, and incidentally in the US presidential election, was around attitudes to immigration, and also whether they lived in areas where there had been major changes in the ethnic profile. So these identity and culture issues, we are looking to find and deal with those. We're also seeing a period of rapid technology change. In the main trends webinar that we did, Bronwyn talked about the use of robots, but we're seeing ways in which our, traditional jobs are being threatened. Historically, that's mostly been blue-collar jobs, and that's going to continue. As Bron said in her presentation, it's not Mexicans that President Trump needs to worry about. Both Mexico and the US need to be worrying about robots. And we're actually seeing that technology change move into white-collar areas. So the estimate is that 50% of accountancy jobs, 40% of legal jobs could disappear within a generation. So we're all threatened by that. And the other thing is that technology has enabled us to hear multiple voices. So we're hearing, whereas traditionally we did have those experts who, so there was a travel writer that we went to. Now, we've always recognized our cohorts in terms of word of mouth, the people we know around us, but suddenly we're able to see multiple more cohorts where we can look at review sites and find people like ourselves. So that suddenly there is a cacophony of voices. Now, what happens is that while we love choice and we love ideas, we need a way to cut through that clutter. And what's therefore happened is another technology change that has happened is that factors like algorithms that learn about our preferences and curate our preferences have meant that we deal with an area of hyper-personalization. So those search engines, those social media platforms are cutting through and showing us to cut through that clutter. They're showing us things that they know will appeal to us. Now, in terms of searching for a holiday, that can be very helpful. It means that when I, as someone who doesn't have kids, am looking to go to an area like the Yarra Valley, I'm also almost automatically going to get wellness stuff, I'm going to get truffle hunts, I'm going to get couples retreats. When Bron searches, she'll actually be looking at it initially for, family things to do. So Healesville Wildlife Sanctuary might be more likely to come up earlier in her feed. But when we come to how we get our news and we inform our opinions, we can actually seriously not see the same pieces of news as anyone else. So the image that I've chosen there is actually two separate sets of feed for the same news item and differentiated by the politics of the person that the search engine knows. Facebook knows more about us, Google knows more about us than our nearest and dearest. There is not one single item in those two news feeds that comes from the same source, uses the same language. So that hyper-personalization means that we are increasingly working in those areas. Okay, so you're saying, oh, look, this is all very interesting and fascinating, Carolyn, and we could all spend hours talking about it. I certainly could. But when we're thinking about making decisions as businesses or as destinations, we need to know why this matters to us and what we need to do about it. So firstly, I would say, yes, it does matter, or we've seen why it matters. 33% of customers saying they're looking for that in just one area of social and environmental good. But if you want to do this properly, it really starts with some fairly core marketing principles. The good news is much of what you need to know is stuff that you should be doing in your business or destination already. And it's about knowing who your customer is, understanding what's important for them as they see it, and understanding what their values are. And this will really help you cut through that clutter to decide which of the issues which you should lead to make a stand on. It also will help you understand how you should execute it, because the other thing with this is you can get passionate about the issue, but if you do it wrong, it's actually not going to work for you. One very good thing about taking a stand is that by doing so, what you are doing is aligning with people who are going to be leaders in driving this for you. So this is a quote from The Guardian, social marketing brands. So brands that take a stand up should not be looking for a safe middle in most cases. I'm going to talk a little bit about where that's different. What they are looking for is these should be issues that are contested enough to feel hot, but your opinion leaders, who are not necessarily the people who are opinion leaders before, these test makers, they tend to be more affluent, they're perfect customers, they're perfect influencers. So this is an influencer strategy where you can see how you can drive conversations without necessarily having to pay to have influence coming through. The reason why I say that understanding of the customer is so important is if you try and execute this in a way that doesn't resonate with your customer, then it will go wrong. So apologies for the slightly weird image way this has come through, but here are a couple of examples of this. So in response to what's happening with the rise of the sharing economy, Victorian Taxis in Australia launched a social media campaign called through Twitter called Your Taxis. The intent was to and linked it to more traditional paid media in terms of advertising. And they talked around the idea of fear and uncertainty and safety concerns with Uber drivers. But what they hadn't realized was that actually customers didn't really see it like that. Customers actually thought Uber was safer than driving in a taxi. And they didn't actually like taxis enough to take this message from taxis. So this was a massive social media own goal where suddenly customers were piling in to talk about cases where taxi drivers had proven not to be the safe option. They were piling in to talk about all the ways that this did not work. So I think by not understanding that, being tone deaf to the consumer's views on things and understanding that the consumer was there, it was an absolute disaster for the taxi industry. Instead, what they actually needed to do was to be persuading people of this and to understand what they could be saying about why you would take a cab. They also actually needed to change, which is one of the things that we'll talk about later. And this is not a political campaign. This was just showing how that politics and the understanding of the customer can even infect your mainstream advertising campaign. So this was a campaign by LG in Canada, where they were promoting a machine that meant you could do 2 sets of laundry at the same time, and it gave you more time to do other things. The trouble was that they'd kind of put it into terms of, you can have a manicure or a pedicure in this, you can go shopping. Now, actually, this did not resonate with how their target audience saw their lives. So they were clearly primarily targeting women. Women of the modern era do not really see themselves like this. They are tired of being patronized in this way. And it really backfired in social media. It also backfired with the secondary audience, which is a failure to recognize that lots of men do their own washing these days. So this was actually my favorite, was Josh Hogan here. Hey, LG Canada, I have a penis and forgot how to do laundry. Can any of you ask one of the ladies to help me? So actually, it really didn't recognize who the customer was, and it went really badly wrong. So this is why even your mainstream advertising needs to think about these social issues these days. The second side of this, and this again is very consistent with what we say you should be doing for all marketing, you need to understand that you know who, not just who your customer is, but who you are and what your brand values are, and articulate them. Because the other thing is these days, consumers, we saw that shift in trust. Consumers will trust brands that have a clear sense of who they are and what their values are. They can smell the phony a mile off. By focusing on what you should care about based on your brand values, you will seem sincere and credible when you talk about it. And it tells you what you have permission to talk about and what you have permission not to talk about. So a nature-based destination, for example, can talk about climate change, for example. And again, I'm going to show you the examples. It's easier usually to find the examples of where it fails than where it doesn't fail. But this is interesting because this is actually 2 campaigns, one where we saw it failing and one where we saw it working, and a brand learning from their mistakes. So these are both campaigns by Starbucks. Now, Starbucks is an explorer brand. It's now so established many of us forget that, but basically at the heart of Starbucks is the idea of doing things a little bit differently. So if Starbucks felt, that they ran a Race Together campaign where they encouraged their baristas to be talking about this and communicating with people. But here's the thing, people coming in from coffee, they didn't think that was Starbucks' job. What they saw was that Starbucks' job was to serve them good coffee and to be a certain type of brand and behave ethically, not lecture them. So the campaign went disastrously wrong. So what then Starbucks did was, instead of that, they moved into building a social media content channel. They created content online and drove consumers who were interested into it, and they used a debate format to do that. Because one thing we understand, and I'll talk about some other examples of this later, is conversations over coffee was a natural space. And the idea of being an explorer brand and talking and bringing together people who had permission to do that is a really, really great way to do it. So really thinking about the execution and what you've got permission to say, and in particular the context in which you've got permission to say it, is very, very important in doing this. Other ways to do it is really think about what your brand attributes are. So this is again Unilever, one of the brands, as I say, that's really taken a lead in this space. Is there a cynical desire to make profit out of this? Probably, but if they are doing good in the world and getting better at doing good in the world, then I think that that is a win-win situation, or actually a win-win-win. Win for us as consumers, win for the causes they celebrate, and win for them as a business. And that's what we're ultimately seeking with political advertising. Sometimes we will have to make hard changes and decisions and change behaviours, but often we can actually, this is a smart decision. So EarthCheck, for example, they talk very often about how making these changes can actually save you money. But this is an example by Unilever. Global hand washing campaign. So they are building a campaign around their product and their brand. So they really clearly have an idea. You know, they produce hand washing products. They produce domestic bleach products. So they've linked their campaigns to their products in ways that make sense, because obviously someone who is selling soap has permission to talk about hygiene. So making you feel like you're donating to help children die needlessly, help prevent children dying needlessly from diarrhea, really, really, really works. And they've picked great brand attributes, people like Halle Berry, as being someone who has permission to talk about it. So aims to reach 1 billion people. It's a fantastic example of how to do it, because it's linked to attributes and even functional attributes of the brand that Unilever has. Now, particularly for many destinations which are complex brands and often managed by government, often you feel like it might be uncomfortable for you to take a stand. But I think, again, firstly, there will be issues on which you do need to take a stand. Now, as I said, one day after President Trump has announced that the USA is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, what we've seen is cities all over America taking a stand saying, no, we're going to work towards those goals because we think it's important for us. Similarly, in response to the travel ban, a number of destinations within the USA have launched campaigns. California, for example, has launched campaigns where they're saying everyone's welcome. So they're actually trying to say, take that stand because they recognize it being for their business. But here are a couple of examples of campaigns that were run around the idea that our customers actually have diverse political opinions. So what you can be in that situation is a bridging brand. One of these is JetBlue, which is a US airline, and they offered free flights to people, and they sat people who were Republicans on one side of the aisle and people who were Democrats on the other. And what you had to do was, they say they would fly you everywhere, but you had to reach across the aisle, and both sides of the aisle had to agree on the destination. So everyone ultimately came up with the idea of going to Costa Rica, and people reached across the aisle and they saw that they had something in common with people they did not think. Similarly, and I particularly love this campaign, Heineken is a brand to watch. I love the way they do their marketing. They are so, so smart. Do check out the YouTube video on this. So this is an experiment where they've used, again, the functional attributes of their brand, the idea of getting together over a beer and sorting things out. So they've brought together people who have very, very different and deeply challenging views compared to one another. And they bring them together, and firstly, they get them to build a bar. Then they tell them that each other has very different opinions, and they invite them to sit down and share a beer and do that. Now, if you think you don't want that, to me, I just look at that view. 12.619 million views of this campaign. An absolutely fabulously engaging campaign that people talk about. For example, people like me talking about it to you. So this is something that you can think about, is if you can't take a stand on an issue either way, can you be that bridging brand? and how can you execute it in a way that works for you. Some of the key things to think about that will help you think about that is when you're thinking about your customers, do understand what's important to them in their lives. Do understand what are their attitudes and beliefs about travel, what's important to them and what do they want. Do think about how your connection or product fits into those attitudes. Think about the language that they use. Look at your social media reviews. Look at your social media pages to see how customers interact with you. Listen to your customers. What's going on? See which of the stories that you put out resonate and work within that. Understand how they perceive you. So do they perceive you as a brand who's got permission to talk about those issues? Understand what is driving their beliefs both about you and about their world and about your destination. Where are they going for information that will help you pick the channels and make that very important challenge about how you do this? What are the images that will resonate? What will make them want to come connect with you? And once you've got them all excited, because one thing about this type of stuff is it really does get people very, very excited, make sure you can deliver by making sure that they can transact with you very, very quickly in those places. That's why understanding those sources is so important. Another caution I would give you is with this kind of stuff, it's very important to get in there and be nimble in doing this. But again, by getting this right, you can see that you cannot be seen to be opportunistic. It has to feel credible and it has to recognize how people feel about this. So 2 airline campaigns from Europe. So on the right, I'm going to talk about that one further. So these are 2 campaigns that came out of the Brexit vote last year. So BA launched a campaign in the US where it talked about your dollar has never gone further, come more, because the pound collapsed after Brexit. It had a very, very dramatic thing. But the problem with that is that BA's customers, who are the most affluent, engaged customers, firstly, were much more likely to be Remainers. Secondly, there are many, many more of them in Europe. And thirdly, they are globally connected citizens. So they were picking up from their globally connected people in North America that this was coming through. So here is a reaction from somebody in the UK. So great bargains. So great bargains with the British pound down the toilet. So at a time when one of their most lucrative customer groups were hurting, BA actually, they felt like they'd had a knife between their nose, and it really, really backfired. So thinking about the ways to do that, I would have been putting that out in ads. I wouldn't necessarily have been following up with social media, but I think I would have been just putting the deals out there without making that point. Just, you've got that opportunity. In contrast, EasyJet did a why not campaign. So it was, look, none of us know what's going to happen here. We don't know what's going to happen with passports, so why not go now? And just the way they did it, and that why not go and see Europe, it really resonated with people and worked really well. And they had a series of videos where they talked about it. So it really worked quite well. I'd encourage you to check out both campaigns. Another really great example of this was the difference between how Uber and Lyft responded to the travel ban. Now, Uber went out there and tried to do a campaign where it didn't do its surge pricing, taking people to airports if they were held up in the US travel ban, the chaos that followed the US travel ban. And problem with that was perceived then by many people as taking money away from cab drivers, whereas what Lyft did was they did it in a very, very different way, and they basically said that they stood behind the values and they basically made a donation. So they didn't seek to capitalize on it in some way. As a result of this, they engaged that audience. So we saw a campaign trending which was no ban, no wait. People actually were unsubscribing from Uber and shifting to Lyft. And Uber has struggled to come back from that because, again, those opinion leaders felt that this was the wrong thing. Many of the taxi drivers they were taking fares away from were actually immigrants themselves. So Lyft's doing it in a different way really worked much better. The other thing to think about is when you are designing campaigns, really do think about this idea of who is in your campaign. Your customers should feel like they can see themselves in that campaign. So here's a great example from Travelability. So if you're trying to target customers, show a more diverse base. If your customers do include people who are accessible travelers, show them really genuine, fun images of, again, knowing how people see themselves. So not fake images that come through. Make it very, very diverse. You've only got to see the backlash. Here in Australia, the Labour Party ran a campaign around the reforms to the 457 visas. Now, whilst it was very clear that they were targeting a very political, a very specific target who are uncomfortable about that, the fact that virtually every single person in that campaign was white really, really did not resonate. So I think if they had had a few different faces in there, they would have got away with that and it would have worked. Instead, it became a social media disaster for the Labour Party. Again, if you're thinking about this, and again, if you feel you can't do the unifying brand thing for some place when you have a diverse customer base, the important thing to think about is who are the most valuable customers to you. And I think, or who are the most valuable audiences to you. So here we have, big business backing the marriage equality campaign in Australia. They've got criticised for that in Parliament, but they clearly decided they can have different conversations with politicians. It's more important for their staff and for their customers to feel that they are in that space. Similarly, the ads that the people who market lamb in Australia run, which I absolutely love, they've been looking at that and thinking about what it means for them. They've clearly decided that a modern multicultural Australia is a much better business opportunity for them, both in terms of opinion leaders and in terms of recognising that 40% of people in Australia were born somewhere else and often look very diverse. So their unifying thing was lamb is the only meat that everyone apart from vegetarians can eat. And their most recent campaign even said vegetarians are welcome at any party where lamb is. So that, to me, is really, really great examples of working out who you can afford to offend before you don't. The other thing I would say is you can't just say it. You've really got to live it in your values every day. Because if you don't, if the experience does not deliver that, then it's not going to work. So all of this work should be contained in your vision and in your strategy. So these kind of issues and how you would talk about things and your values on wider issues should be grounded there. You need to ensure that your staff understand your brand values and how to execute them, and you need to empower them to do so. Because again, if you're saying that you're someone who welcomes people of very diverse backgrounds or very diverse experiences, very inclusive, if your staff don't exhibit that behaviour and are not empowered to deliver on that, it's going to go wrong. Make sure that you have your language and your tone of voice consistent in all your communications, and if it's grounded in your vision and your strategy and your brand, that will work. You need to remember that as leaders in your business, does your leadership style reflect those values? Because if you don't embody those values, your staff, your people will not embody it either. So if you say you are an inclusive valuer who respects different opinions, you've really got to do that. And you need to make sure that your product, your service, or your experience is designed and executed to deliver on those values. So make sure you know that, make sure you review it, make sure you change what you need to change, and then keep, rinse, review, repeat. As with your marketing, with every aspect of what you do as a business, it should be a constant learning environment. If you do this, you will get engaged customers who will be your best advocates. When it's working well, it's a true virtuous circle. So that's the end of our session on post-truth and post-truth advertising, political advertising. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I'd say have a look around, because more and more I'm seeing that. I walk out of my home today and there is an ad for Patagonia, which has been a leading brand in advocating on climate change, for example, and on issues like recycling and environmental issues. So I've actually seen ads, on my street. I'm now seeing this kind of advertising everywhere. So I do encourage you to look at it, and I do encourage you to think about how it might work for you.